A loyal employee is falsely accused of theft and cast out, his life shattered. Years later, fate brings him face to face with the ruthless boss who ruined him. Only now, the tables have turned, and his former employer's survival rests in his hands. But the darkest secret is yet to be revealed. For over 2 decades, Robert Dawson had been the heart of Dawson and Company, a thriving family business run by Charles Anderson, a powerful and wealthy man in his 60s. Robert had started working there fresh out of college, climbing his way up through dedication, hard work, and loyalty. Everyone in the company knew him as dependable, trustworthy, and honest, someone who would never let the company down. Charles, however, was always distant, rarely showing appreciation or compassion for his employees, including Robert. But one fateful day, everything Robert had built crumbled in an instant. It began with an unexpected meeting. The entire office was buzzing with rumors as Charles called a company-wide assembly. Robert entered the conference room, noticing that people were avoiding his gaze. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Then, Charles entered the room with a stern, unforgiving expression. He threw a stack of papers onto the table, and with a voice full of accusation, he said, "Robert, I trusted you. I gave you the keys to this company, and this is how you repay me." Robert's heart sank. He stood there, frozen, unsure of what was happening. Charles continued, "Large sums of money have gone missing from our accounts, and all evidence points to you." The room fell silent. Robert's face turned pale. He looked at the faces of his colleagues, people he had worked with for years, but all he saw were blank stares, eyes filled with doubt and suspicion. His voice quivered as he responded, I don't understand. I would never." But Charles cut him off, slamming his fist on the table. "Save your excuses, Robert. You've been stealing from me, from this company, and from everyone here. You're fired. Get out of my sight." Robert's entire world shattered in that moment. He tried to defend himself, but no one would listen. His protests fell on deaf ears as security was called to escort him out of the building. As he was dragged away, the humiliation of being thrown out like a criminal in front of his colleagues, people who had once respected him, was unbearable. The looks of disgust, disappointment, and pity on their faces were too much to bear. That night, Robert walked the streets alone, feeling the cold wind biting at his skin. He didn't know how he would tell his wife, Sarah, about what had happened. Sarah was his rock. She had supported him through every hardship they'd faced together. And now, as she lay in a hospital bed battling stage 4 cancer, the thought of burdening her with this unbearable shame and loss was enough to break his heart. When Robert finally returned home, the small apartment they had moved into after selling their house to cover Sarah's medical bills felt colder and emptier than ever before. He stood at the door of their bedroom watching her sleep. Her face, pale and frail, was still beautiful to him, but he could see the toll that her illness had taken. She was exhausted, her body fighting a battle it was slowly losing. He couldn't bring himself to wake her, to tell her that he had lost his job, the one thing keeping them afloat. As he sat beside her, tears rolled down his face, his mind racing with questions. How could everything go so wrong so quickly? Why would Charles do this to him? He had been loyal for so many years, sacrificing so much for the company. And now, without warning, his life was destroyed. But Robert knew he couldn't show weakness. Sarah needed him to be strong. Their son, Daniel, who had just started his first year of college, depended on him too. Robert couldn't afford to fall apart, even though everything in his soul was breaking. He had to figure out a way to keep going, for his family, for Sarah. As he sat in the darkness of their apartment, the weight of the accusations pressed heavily on his chest. He felt like a failure, a man who had lost not only his job but his dignity, his reputation, and his sense of self. All he could think about was how to tell Sarah without breaking her spirit, and how to face a future that now seemed hopeless. The night stretched on endlessly, with Robert's mind caught in an endless loop of fear and despair. He hadn't stolen anything. He knew that, but the reality was no one would believe him, not after what Charles had said. His spotless reputation had been ripped apart, and now he was a man without a job, without security, and with a family depending on him during the most difficult time of their lives. As the first light of dawn filtered through the curtains, Robert made a silent vow to himself. He would find out why this had happened. He would uncover the truth no matter what it took. And he would do whatever it took to protect his family, even if it meant enduring the worst humiliation of his life. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much darker journey, one that would test his strength, his faith, and his very soul. The morning after his humiliating dismissal, Robert felt as though he were living in a nightmare. His body ached from the emotional weight of the previous day, and the exhaustion of endless worry had settled deep into his bones. His thoughts raced as he sat at the small kitchen table in their modest apartment, trying to figure out how he would keep everything from falling apart. Sarah was still sleeping in the next room, her breathing weak and labored. He knew she wouldn't be able to handle the news, not in her fragile state. So, with a heavy heart, Robert made a decision. He wouldn't tell her. Not yet. He would find another job, any job, to keep them afloat, and when things were more stable, he would explain everything. For now, she needed peace, and he was determined to give it to her. But finding a job in his condition, with the reputation he now had, was going to be nearly impossible. He grabbed his jacket and headed out into the chilly morning air, determined to visit every place he could think of to find work. As he walked through the city, the familiar streets that once held promise and opportunity now seemed cold and indifferent. His mind replayed Charles's cruel accusations over and over again. He had always been a loyal employee, never once giving anyone reason to doubt his integrity. Yet, here he was, wandering the streets like a criminal, his name stained with dishonor. Robert visited several businesses that day, handing out resumes and asking for any available positions. Each rejection felt like a punch to the gut. "We don't have anything right now," they would say, or worse, "Aren't you the guy from Dawson and Company who got fired for stealing?" The rumors had spread like wildfire. The looks of suspicion and distrust from strangers only deepened Robert's sense of isolation. By the afternoon, Robert was exhausted and disheartened. He had been turned away from every place he visited. He walked past the grand building of Dawson and Company, the company that had once been his pride, and he couldn't help but stop. Through the large windows, he could see his former co-workers going about their business as if nothing had changed. They didn't notice him, standing there on the sidewalk, looking like a broken man. As Robert stood there, lost in thought, he felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see George, one of the janitors who had worked at Dawson and Company for years. George had always been kind to Robert, though they hadn't spoken much beyond casual greetings. "Robert, what are you doing here?" George asked, concern evident in his voice. I don't know, George. I guess I just wanted to see if any of this makes sense," Robert replied, his voice heavy with emotion. George nodded slowly. "I heard what happened. It ain't right what they did to you. I know you didn't steal nothing. You were always a good man." Robert felt a lump rise in his throat. It was the first time anyone had expressed belief in his innocence since the accusations. "Thanks, George," Robert said quietly. "But it doesn't matter what's true anymore. Charles has already decided, and now I've got nothing." George looked around to make sure no one was watching before lowering his voice. "I'm not supposed to say nothing, but I've been hearing things. The accounting department, they've been acting real shady lately. Some of those new people Charles hired, I don't trust them." Robert's heart skipped a beat. Could it be possible that someone in accounting had framed him? He had worked closely with that department for years, handling sensitive company finances. It wouldn't be hard for someone to plant false evidence. "Do you think they could have set me up?" Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. George hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "All I'm saying is, don't give up just yet. Keep your eyes open." With that, George gave Robert a reassuring pat on the shoulder and walked away, leaving Robert standing there, his mind racing. Maybe there was still hope. Maybe he could prove his innocence. But how? Without access to the company records, he was at a loss. And even if he could gather evidence, would anyone believe him? As Robert walked back home that evening, the cold wind biting at his skin, he felt a small flicker of determination. He couldn't let Charles win. He had to keep fighting, if not for himself, then for Sarah and Daniel. They deserved better than this. When he arrived home, Sarah was awake, sitting up in bed with a weak smile. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice soft and tired. Robert forced a smile. "It was fine. Just ran some errands." She studied his face for a moment, sensing that something was wrong, but she didn't press him. Instead, she patted the space next to her, and he sat down beside her, taking her frail hand in his. "I was thinking," she said softly, "once I get better, maybe we can take that trip to the coast we always talked about. Just you, me, and Daniel. What do you think?" Robert swallowed hard, blinking back tears. He knew she wouldn't be getting better. The doctors had made that clear, though she refused to give up hope. He couldn't bring himself to crush her dreams. "That sounds perfect," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. As he held her hand, feeling the warmth of her love, Robert made another silent vow. He would find out who was behind this. He would clear his name no matter how long it took. But most of all, he would protect his family from the darkness that had overtaken their lives. Little did he know the worst was yet to come. The days following Robert's conversation with George were agonizingly slow. Every morning, he would wake up, force a smile for Sarah, and then go out to search for a job, all while the gnawing thoughts of his ruined reputation lingered like a heavy fog. His savings were quickly running dry. The bills piled up, and the cost of Sarah's medication became a cruel reminder of their deteriorating situation. Robert was growing desperate. The idea of confronting Charles and trying to prove his innocence flickered in his mind, but it seemed impossible. Charles had made up his mind, and his influence over the company was too strong. One particularly cold afternoon, Robert returned home after another fruitless day of job hunting. As he entered the small apartment, the silence felt unnerving. Sarah was asleep in their bedroom and Daniel was at school. Robert slumped into the worn-out couch, his head in his hands. He was spiraling. How had his life fallen apart so quickly? His mind flashed back to Dawson and company, to the day Charles had accused him in front of everyone. He had been humiliated, treated like a common criminal. The memory of his co-workers' judgmental stares haunted him. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Robert's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, he found George standing there, his expression serious. "Robert, I need to talk to you," George said quietly, stepping inside. Robert closed the door behind him, surprised by the urgency in George's voice. "I've been hearing some things, and it's worse than I thought," George continued, lowering his voice as if someone might be listening. "There's a rumor going around that Charles isn't just firing people. He's using the company for something shady. I don't know the details, but something ain't right with the finances. People are talking." Robert felt a cold chill run down his spine. "What do you mean? What are they saying?" "There's talk of money missing from the company accounts. Large amounts. And it's not just you who got accused. A few others have been quietly let go, too. I think Charles is trying to cover his tracks, and you were just the easiest one to pin it on." The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. Could it really be true? Had Charles framed him to protect himself? It all made sense now. The sudden accusations, the quick dismissal, and the way his co-workers had turned against him so quickly. "What should I do, George? How can I prove any of this?" Robert asked, his voice filled with desperation. George sighed, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I don't know, Robert, but you've got to be careful. If Charles is involved in something illegal, he's not going to let you dig too deep without fighting back." Robert clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had been wronged, and now he had to figure out how to uncover the truth. But how? He was an outsider now, cut off from the company and everyone who might be able to help him. George placed a reassuring hand on Robert's shoulder. "Look, I'll keep my ears open. There's got to be something we can do. But don't lose hope. All right?" Robert nodded, though hope felt like a distant memory. After George left, he sat in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The next morning, as Robert prepared to head out again, Sarah stopped him at the door. Her face was pale, and her voice trembled. "Robert, we need to talk." His heart sank. He had been avoiding this conversation for weeks, but he could no longer escape it. "What's wrong, Sarah?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I've been feeling worse," she whispered, clutching the edge of the table for support. "The medication isn't helping anymore. I think we need to go to the hospital." Robert felt the floor drop out from beneath him. They couldn't afford a hospital visit. Not now. But the look in Sarah's eyes told him they had no choice. Without hesitation, Robert nodded. "All right, we'll go. Let me just grab my jacket." The hospital was a stark contrast to their modest apartment. The sterile white walls and the cold, clinical atmosphere made Robert feel out of place. As they waited for the doctor, Robert's mind raced. How were they going to pay for this? Would they even be able to get the treatment Sarah needed? After what felt like an eternity, the doctor finally entered the room. He was an older man with kind eyes, but his expression was serious. "Mr. and Mrs. Clark," he began, his voice measured. "I've reviewed Sarah's medical records, and I'm afraid her condition has progressed more than we initially thought." Robert's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The doctor sighed. "Sarah's illness is advanced. We need to start more aggressive treatment immediately, but it's expensive. Without insurance or a financial plan in place, I'm not sure how we can proceed." Robert felt like the walls were closing in on him. He looked at Sarah, who was staring down at her hands, her face pale and fragile. The thought of losing her, of not being able to help her, was unbearable. "We'll find a way," Robert said, his voice trembling. "We'll do whatever it takes." But deep down, he knew that whatever it takes might not be enough. As they left the hospital, the weight of the world seemed to rest on Robert's shoulders. How had everything spiraled so far out of control? He had no job, no money, and now, the love of his life was slipping away from him, and he couldn't do anything to stop it. That night, as Sarah slept beside him, Robert lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind churned with desperation and fear. He needed to find a way to clear his name, to get his job back, to pay for Sarah's treatment. But with each passing day, hope felt more like a distant dream, and Robert was running out of time. The next morning, as the sun barely peeked through the clouds, Robert made a silent vow. He would not let Charles Dawson destroy everything he held dear. He would fight no matter the cost, no matter the odds. But as the days grew darker, so too did the challenges ahead. And unbeknownst to Robert, the worst betrayal was yet to come. The next few days passed in a blur of dread and anxiety. Robert's mind was consumed by the thoughts of Sarah's worsening condition and the mounting hospital bills. The financial strain was suffocating. He spent his days frantically searching for work, knocking on doors and visiting companies, but no one would hire him. His reputation had been too deeply tarnished by the accusations from Dawson and company. Each night, as Sarah's health continued to decline, Robert felt a growing sense of helplessness. He would sit beside her, holding her hand, his heart aching as he watched her struggle to breathe, to smile. Their son, Daniel, was beginning to sense the gravity of the situation. He asked fewer questions, but his worried eyes followed Robert everywhere, silently pleading for reassurance that his mother would be okay. One evening, after another agonizing day, Robert sat at the kitchen table, staring at the bills spread out before him. He could barely think straight. The sound of Sarah's labored breathing from the bedroom was a constant reminder of how little time they had left. They couldn't wait any longer for a miracle. Robert needed to act. Out of sheer desperation, he decided to do the one thing he had been avoiding. He needed to confront Charles Dawson directly. He had no other choice. Robert believed that if he could just sit down with Charles and explain himself, there was still a chance to clear his name and possibly regain his job. It was a long shot, but it was all he had left. The next morning, Robert gathered what little courage he had left and headed to Dawson and Company, the company where his life had fallen apart. As he approached the tall glass building, memories of better days flooded his mind. Days when he was respected, trusted, and considered an essential part of the business. But now, as he stepped through those familiar doors, he felt like a ghost. Inside, everything looked the same, yet so different. Colleagues who once greeted him warmly now avoided his gaze, their faces filled with suspicion and judgment. The receptionist, a young woman named Laura who used to chat with Robert every morning, barely acknowledged his presence as he asked to see Charles Dawson. "I'm sorry, Mr. Clark," she said curtly, not even looking up from her computer screen. "Mr. Dawson isn't available. You'll have to make an appointment." "Laura, please," Robert pleaded, his voice thick with emotion. "It's urgent. I just need a few minutes of his time." She finally looked up, her eyes cold and unsympathetic. "I'm afraid that's not possible. You'll have to leave now." Humiliated, Robert turned to go, but as he walked toward the exit, he heard a familiar voice behind him. "What are you doing here?" Robert spun around to see Charles Dawson standing a few feet away, arms crossed and a smug expression on his face. He looked just as Robert remembered: sharp suit, perfectly combed hair, and the air of superiority that always seemed to follow him. "I came to talk to you," Robert said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I need to clear my name. You know I didn't steal anything." Charles chuckled, his laugh dripping with condescension. "You still don't get it, do you? I don't care if you're innocent or not. You were the perfect scapegoat. And now you're just another piece of trash, out of my life for good." The words hit Robert like a punch to the gut. He had suspected Charles was behind his fall from grace, but hearing it spoken aloud left him breathless. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. "But why?" Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I was loyal. I worked hard for this company for years. Why would you do this to me?" Charles stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Because I could. You were nothing, Robert. Just another expendable employee. You trusted me, and that made you easy to manipulate. I needed someone to blame for the missing money, and you were the perfect candidate." Robert felt his knees weaken, the room spinning around him. It had all been a lie, a cruel game Charles had played with his life. Everything he had worked for, every ounce of respect he had earned, had been torn away by this man standing in front of him, smirking as if it was nothing. I have nothing left," Robert stammered. "My wife, she's dying. We have no money, no insurance. I just need my job back so I can take care of her. Please." Charles's smirk turned into a sneer. "That's not my problem. You're not getting your job back, and you're not getting any help from me. Now, get out of my office." Robert stood frozen in place, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the humiliation and the hopelessness of his situation was suffocating. He had been so foolish to think Charles would show him any mercy. Slowly, Robert turned and walked out of the building. His head hung low, and his feet felt like lead as he stepped out into the cold, harsh air. He had nothing left. No job, no hope, and soon, he would lose the woman he loved more than anything. When he returned home that evening, the despair was too much to hide. Sarah noticed immediately. She tried to comfort him, but Robert could see the pain in her eyes. She knew what his failure meant for their future, for her future. The conversation at the hospital came back to him like a haunting echo. They were running out of time. Later that night, after Sarah had fallen into a restless sleep, Robert stood by the window, staring out into the dark. His reflection in the glass looked broken, defeated, but deep down something else stirred. A flicker of anger, of determination. Charles had taken everything from him, but Robert wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. There had to be a way to fight back, to expose the truth, to clear his name, and to provide for his family. But as he stood there, alone in the night, he knew that whatever came next would push him to the edge of everything he thought he could endure. And just when he thought things couldn't get worse, a phone call would come the next day, bringing the darkest turn of all. The following morning, Robert woke to the sound of his phone ringing on the nightstand. His heart sank immediately. Calls at that hour rarely brought good news. He hesitated for a moment before answering, dreading what was coming next. "Hello?" he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Mr. Clark." The voice on the other end was unfamiliar but formal, cold even. "This is Dr. Jenkins from the hospital. I'm calling about your wife, Sarah." Robert's blood ran cold. His hands trembled as he gripped the phone tightly. He had been expecting this call, but nothing could have prepared him for the moment when it actually came. She's not." Robert could barely form the words, his throat tightening as fear and dread washed over him. "She's stable for now," the doctor replied, "but her condition has worsened significantly overnight. We're doing everything we can, but Mr. Clark, I'm afraid the treatments aren't working as we hoped. We need to discuss her options moving forward." Robert's knees buckled, and he sank onto the edge of the bed. Sarah had been fighting for so long, but this felt like the beginning of the end. His mind raced as he thought about the conversations they had had late at night, her telling him how tired she was, how much pain she was in. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Robert managed to say before hanging up. He sat there for a long time, staring blankly at the wall. Sarah's battle with her illness had taken everything from them. Their savings, their peace of mind, and now it was coming for the last piece of his heart. But he couldn't break down now. Sarah needed him. Daniel needed him. He had to stay strong, even if every part of him was crumbling inside. Robert dressed quickly and went to check on Daniel, who was still asleep in his small bed, clutching his favorite stuffed animal. Robert gently brushed a hand over his son's hair, fighting back tears. Daniel was too young to understand everything that was happening, but he knew something was wrong, and soon he would have to face a world without his mother. After dropping Daniel off at a neighbor's house, Robert hurried to the hospital. When he arrived, he was greeted by Dr. Jenkins, who led him to Sarah's room. She looked so fragile, her skin pale and her breathing shallow. Machines beeped softly around her, a reminder that she was slipping away despite their best efforts. Sarah opened her eyes weakly when she heard Robert enter. She smiled at him, but it was a tired smile, one that carried the weight of years of pain and suffering. "Hey," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hey," Robert replied, sitting down beside her and taking her hand in his. "I'm here." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands entwined, their hearts heavy with the unspoken truth. They both knew what was coming, but neither of them wanted to say it out loud. "Robert," Sarah began softly, her eyes filling with tears, "I need you to promise me something." "Anything," he whispered, leaning closer to hear her. "I need you to take care of Daniel. He's going to need you more than ever." Her voice cracked as she spoke, the weight of her request pressing down on her frail body. Robert's throat tightened. "Don't talk like that, Sarah. We're going to get through this. You're going to get better." But even as he said the words, he didn't believe them. The doctors had said there was little hope left, and he could see it in Sarah's eyes. She was ready to let go, and it broke him to know he couldn't save her. "I'm so sorry," Robert whispered, his voice shaking. "I failed you. I failed both of you." Sarah squeezed his hand as tightly as she could manage. "You haven't failed us, Robert. You've done everything you could. I know that." Her words offered little comfort, though he could see she meant them. The guilt and despair gnawed at him, a constant reminder that he hadn't been able to protect the people he loved the most. He had been stripped of everything, his job, his dignity, and now he was about to lose Sarah, the woman who had been his anchor through every storm. As the hours passed, Sarah slipped in and out of consciousness. Robert stayed by her side, refusing to leave her for even a moment. He didn't know how much time they had left together, but he was determined to be there for her, no matter what. Eventually, as the sun began to set, Dr. Jenkins returned to the room. He looked somber, his face lined with the weariness of someone who had seen far too many good people suffer. "Mr. Clark," he said gently, "there's something you need to know." Robert looked up, his heart pounding in his chest. "What is it?" The doctor hesitated for a moment, as if unsure how to deliver the news. "We've discovered something in Sarah's medical history that might change everything. There's a chance, just a chance, that her condition could be tied to a rare genetic disorder. We need to run some tests to confirm, but if this is the case, it could explain why she hasn't responded to treatment." Robert stared at him, unable to process the information. A genetic disorder? Something that had been there all along, hidden in her DNA? He didn't know whether to feel hopeful or terrified. If this was true, it meant there was still a sliver of hope for Sarah. But it also meant that her suffering had been prolonged unnecessarily, that they might have found a solution sooner if only they had known. "Do whatever you have to do," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "Please, just help her." The doctor nodded and left the room to make the necessary arrangements. Robert sat back down beside Sarah, his mind reeling from the revelation. He had thought they were at the end of the road, but now there was a new twist, a new mystery to unravel. As he watched Sarah sleep, he couldn't help but wonder, what else had been hidden from them? What other secrets lay buried in their past, waiting to be uncovered? And though he didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning of a much darker journey, one that would force Robert to confront painful truths about his family, about himself, and about the man who had destroyed his life. The worst was yet to come. The next few days were a whirlwind for Robert. Between spending every waking hour at Sarah's side and anxiously awaiting the results of the genetic tests, he barely had time to process the deepening fear that gnawed at him. The hospital hallways seemed endless, a maze of sterile white walls that mirrored the cold uncertainty hanging over his life. One morning, Dr. Jenkins entered the room with a stack of papers clutched tightly in his hand. His expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, something Robert hadn't seen in a long time. "Hope." "Mr. Clark," the doctor began, "we've reviewed the test results. Sarah does have the rare genetic disorder we suspected. It's called Branson syndrome. It affects how the body processes certain treatments, which explains why her response to chemotherapy and other medications has been so poor." Robert's heart pounded. "But what does this mean? Is there anything we can do now?" Dr. Jenkins hesitated before continuing. "There's a specialized treatment for Branson syndrome. It's experimental and not widely available, but there's a clinic in Boston that has been testing it with some success. If Sarah qualifies, we can transfer her there immediately." It was a lifeline, but Robert couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. How had they not known about this sooner? He'd spent years watching his wife suffer, thinking that her illness was random, unexplainable. But if this disorder had been hiding in her all along, there had to be a reason they hadn't found it before. "Doctor," Robert asked, his voice low and trembling, "how is it possible that this disorder wasn't detected earlier? We've been through so many tests, so many doctors." Dr. Jenkins shifted uncomfortably. "Branson syndrome is hereditary, Mr. Clark. It's passed down through family lines, but it's very rare, which is why it wasn't considered until now." Hereditary. The word echoed in Robert's mind. It was a cold realization, sinking deep into his bones. That meant someone in Sarah's family had to have it or had carried it. And yet, no one had ever spoken of it. No doctors in her past had noticed it in her records, and her parents had died long before any of this came to light. Suddenly, a wave of nausea hit him. There was a part of Sarah's past that had always been vague, shrouded in silence. She had been adopted as a baby, never knowing her biological family. Could it be that this illness had come from them? Had Sarah inherited something from people she never even knew? As Robert sat beside Sarah's bed, these questions began to haunt him. He realized how little he truly knew about the woman he loved, and how much of her life had been shaped by mysteries neither of them had been able to solve. A few days later, as they prepared for Sarah's transfer to the Boston clinic, another bombshell hit. Robert had been in his office at the hospital, sorting through some paperwork, when a nurse approached him with a letter. It was sealed and addressed to him in handwriting he didn't recognize. Confused, he opened it, unfolding the yellowing paper with care. The letter was from a lawyer's office in Boston, dated more than 30 years ago. It was a letter of confirmation, confirming that Sarah's biological father had placed her for adoption under a closed agreement. But there was something else, something that sent Robert's heart into freefall. Sarah's biological father had been a man named James Monroe, a name Robert had heard before, though he couldn't place it immediately. But the letter contained a name that he knew all too well, a name that made his stomach turn with rage and disbelief. The name of the man who had adopted her was William Garrett. William Garrett, Robert's former boss, the man who had ruined his life, accused him of theft, and left him to rot. The man who had taken everything from him was Sarah's adoptive father. Robert's hands shook as he read the letter again and again, the words blurring together. How could this be possible? Sarah had never mentioned the name Garrett in connection to her family. She had never even known the full story of her adoption. But the truth was staring him in the face, as ugly and twisted as it could be. All these years, he had believed that William Garrett had been nothing more than a cruel, heartless businessman. But now, it seemed that their lives were even more intertwined than he could have ever imagined. This man, this monster, had been a part of Sarah's life from the very beginning, and Robert had never known. His mind reeled with the implications. Had Garrett known all along? Had he orchestrated this somehow as part of his revenge on Robert? The questions were overwhelming, and Robert could hardly breathe as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The hospital room felt suffocating, and Robert rushed out into the hallway, gasping for air. His world had been turned upside down. The man who had destroyed his life was now part of Sarah's past, and by extension, his future. And the worst part was he had no idea what to do next. How could he tell Sarah the truth? How could he possibly explain the connection between her illness, her adoption, and the man who had been a ghost in their lives for so long? Robert collapsed onto a bench in the hospital corridor, his mind racing. Everything he had believed about his life, his family, and his enemies had been shattered. And now, as Sarah's condition worsened, he was left to pick up the pieces. But one thing was certain: William Garrett was not done with him yet, and Robert would have to confront the man who had ruined him, once and for all. Robert couldn't sleep that night. The weight of the letter burned in his mind, and the realization that William Garrett, the man who had destroyed his career and reputation, was also linked to Sarah through her adoption was unbearable. Every memory of Garrett's cold, arrogant face flashed in front of him, intertwined with the image of his beloved wife lying helpless in a hospital bed. How had their lives become so intertwined? And why hadn't Sarah ever known the truth? The next morning, Robert made a decision. He had to confront William Garrett. He couldn't let this fester any longer. He needed answers. His heart raced as he made the call, tracking down Garrett's current address through old contacts. To his surprise, Garrett still lived in the same lavish mansion that Robert had visited years ago when he had been an employee at the company. It was a bitter reminder of how much Garrett had taken from him. With a deep breath, Robert drove to the mansion, every mile filled with anger and confusion. He had to know why Garrett had allowed this secret to remain buried for so long. And more importantly, he needed to understand if Garrett had known all along about Sarah's illness. If this was just another piece of his cruel game. When Robert arrived at the mansion, he felt a wave of nausea wash over him. The grandeur of the place was sickening, a testament to Garrett's wealth and power. He knocked on the door with more force than he intended, his heart pounding in his chest. A butler opened the door, looking surprised to see Robert. "Can I help you, sir?" the man asked politely. "I need to see Mr. Garrett. It's urgent," Robert demanded, his voice shaking with emotion. The butler hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Please come in. I will let him know you're here." Robert stepped into the massive foyer, his eyes scanning the familiar opulence that now felt so foreign to him. He waited, his hands clenched into fists, until he heard footsteps echoing down the marble hallway. William Garrett appeared, looking as sharp and composed as ever, though age had softened some of his features. Still, his expression was as cold and calculating as Robert remembered. "Robert Clark," Garrett said, his voice dripping with false civility. "What a surprise. I didn't expect to see you here after all these years. What brings you to my door?" Robert's blood boiled at the sight of him, but he kept his voice steady. "I know the truth, Garrett. I know about Sarah's adoption, and I know you're involved." Garrett's face betrayed nothing, but there was a brief flicker in his eyes. He took a step closer, narrowing his gaze. "I see," he said slowly. "And what exactly do you think you know, Robert?" Robert pulled the letter from his pocket, holding it up for Garrett to see. I found this letter from a lawyer's office in Boston. Confirms everything. You were the one who adopted Sarah. You've known all along, haven't you? And yet you kept it from us. Why didn't you tell her the truth?" Garrett stared at the letter for a long moment before letting out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You've always been so naive, Robert. You think this is some grand revelation? You think this changes anything?" His voice was cold, dismissive, as if Robert's anger meant nothing to him. "Answer me," Robert shouted, his patience snapping. "Why didn't you tell her? Why did you let her suffer, never knowing who her real family was? And what about the illness? Did you know that she had Branson syndrome? Is that why you adopted her? To cover it up?" Garrett's eyes flashed with something dark and cruel. "You really think this is all about Sarah, don't you?" He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a menacing whisper. "The truth is, I adopted her because I needed a pawn. Someone to manipulate, someone to keep me connected to people like you. Her illness? Coincidence, nothing more. But it worked in my favor, didn't it?" Robert was stunned. The words felt like daggers in his heart. "You used her like a tool? She was just a child. She trusted you." "Trust?" Garrett laughed again, a harsh, bitter sound. "Trust is for fools. I've built my empire on manipulation, on knowing how to use people like chess pieces. And you, Robert, were just another piece on the board." Robert's fists clenched as he fought to control his rage. "You ruined my life," he hissed through gritted teeth. "You accused me of theft, destroyed my career, my reputation. And now I find out that you've been manipulating Sarah's life as well. How could you do this?" Garrett's expression hardened. "I did what I had to do to maintain control. You were becoming too close to the truth back then. I needed you gone, and accusing you of theft was the easiest way to make that happen. But don't think for a second that any of this was personal, Robert. It was business. Nothing more." Robert was shaking with fury. "Business? You call destroying lives business? You're a monster, Garrett. And I swear to God, you're going to pay for what you've done." Garrett's smile faded, replaced by a cold sneer. "I wouldn't be so sure of that, Robert. I still hold all the cards. You're just a man with nothing left to lose. But me, I have everything." The tension in the room was suffocating, the weight of their years of hatred bearing down on them. But Robert wasn't going to leave without a fight. "You may have everything," Robert said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I have the truth, and that's more powerful than you'll ever be." Garrett's face twitched, just for a moment, as if the truth finally hit him. But before he could respond, a noise came from the hallway. Footsteps, hurried and frantic. It was the butler again, his face pale and his eyes wide with shock. "Mr. Garrett?" the butler stammered. "You need to come quickly. There's been an accident. Sarah, she's been taken back to the hospital. It's urgent." Robert's heart sank. Sarah? What had happened? Without another word, Robert turned and ran for the door, Garrett following closely behind. The ride to the hospital was a blur for Robert. His mind raced, thinking only of Sarah. The butler's words echoed in his ears. "Sarah? Hospital? Urgent." He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his heart pounding in his chest. Next to him, William Garrett sat in silence, his usual cold demeanor replaced by a rare look of concern. As they arrived at the hospital, Robert practically leaped out of the car and ran through the doors, his legs trembling beneath him. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making the atmosphere even more tense. He quickly approached the nurse at the reception desk. "Sarah Clark," Robert said, breathless. "Where is she? What happened?" The nurse looked up sympathetically. "She's in the ICU," she said softly. "Her condition, it's critical. You can see her, but only one person at a time." Robert nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He wanted to run straight to her side, but as he turned, he saw Garrett standing a few feet away, staring blankly at the floor. For a moment, Robert's anger flared. This was the man who had manipulated Sarah's life, who had used her as a pawn in his twisted game. But the sight of Garrett's pale face gave Robert pause. It was clear that, for the first time, Garrett was shaken. Without a word, Garrett gestured for Robert to go in first. Robert hesitated, then walked down the hallway toward the ICU, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. When he entered Sarah's room, the sight before him broke his heart. Sarah lay in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines, her face pale and fragile. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors was the only sound in the room. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and Robert felt tears welling up in his eyes. He approached the bed slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for hers. "I'm here, Sarah," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'm here." For a long moment, there was nothing but silence, and Robert feared that she wouldn't wake up. But then, slowly, her eyes fluttered open, and she turned her head slightly to look at him. Her gaze was weak, but she managed a faint smile. "Robert," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He squeezed her hand gently, blinking back his tears. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I never wanted any of this to happen. I should have protected you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head slowly. "It's not your fault, Robert," she said softly. "I've known, for a while, about everything." Robert's heart skipped a beat. "You knew?" he asked, his voice trembling. She nodded weakly. "I found out about the adoption, about William. I didn't want to tell you because I knew how much it would hurt you. I thought I could handle it on my own." Robert's throat tightened, the full weight of the secret crashing down on him. "Sarah, you should have told me. I would have helped you." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she looked at him, her voice trembling. "I didn't want you to hate him," she whispered. "I didn't want you to hate your father." Robert froze, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. His father? What was she talking about? What do you mean?" Robert stammered, his mind spinning. Sarah's eyes filled with sorrow, and she squeezed his hand as tightly as she could manage. "Robert, William Garrett is your father." The world seemed to stop. Robert felt as though the ground had fallen out from under him. His breath caught in his throat, and he stumbled backward, unable to process what she had just said. "No, that's impossible," he whispered, shaking his head in disbelief. "It can't be true." But Sarah nodded weakly, her tears flowing freely now. "It's true. He gave me the adoption papers. He told me everything." Robert staggered, his mind racing with disbelief and horror. William Garrett, his lifelong enemy, the man who had ruined his career and life, was his father? How could that be? How could the man who had tormented him for years, who had destroyed everything he held dear, be the same man who had given him life? Just then, the door to the room creaked open, and Garrett stepped inside. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, as if he had aged years in the span of minutes. He looked from Sarah to Robert, and for the first time in his life, he seemed vulnerable. "It's true, Robert," Garrett said quietly, his voice devoid of the usual arrogance. "I'm your father." Robert's legs gave out, and he sank into the chair beside Sarah's bed, his head in his hands. "Why?" he croaked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Garrett's eyes filled with regret as he stood at the foot of the bed. "I wanted to protect you," he said softly. "I thought, if you knew the truth, it would only complicate things. You had a good life, Robert. You had a career, a family. I didn't want to disrupt that, but I made mistakes, pushed you away. I let my pride and ambition destroy everything." Robert's mind swirled with anger, confusion, and sadness. His entire life had been built on a lie, His hatred for William Garrett, the man who had been his enemy for so long, was now tainted by the revelation that this man was his father. How was he supposed to reconcile that? Garrett stepped closer, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry, Robert," he said quietly. "I'm sorry for everything. I can't undo the past, but I want to make things right. Sarah, she's part of this too. I owe both of you the truth." Robert looked up, tears streaming down his face. "You lied to me my whole life," he whispered. "You destroyed everything. How can I forgive that?" Garrett's expression crumbled, and for the first time, Robert saw the man behind the mask. The man who had lived with the burden of guilt and regret for years. "You don't have to forgive me," Garrett said softly, "but I hope someday you'll understand why I did what I did. I've lost so much already. I don't want to lose you too." The room was heavy with silence, the weight of the revelation pressing down on all of them. Robert's heart ached with grief, torn between the anger he had carried for years and the fragile bond that had just been revealed. In the end, it was Sarah who spoke, her voice faint but filled with hope. "Robert, he's your father, and we don't have much time left. Please, don't let this end in hate." Robert looked at her, the love of his life, the woman who had been through so much, and he knew that she was right. Hate had consumed him for years, but now there was a chance for something else. With a heavy heart, Robert stood up and faced Garrett, the man he had despised for so long, and for the first time in his life, he saw him not as an enemy, but as the man who had made mistakes. Grave mistakes, but a man nonetheless. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Robert said, his voice steady but raw. "But for Sarah's sake, I'll try."